When I learned of his betrayal, it felt as if time had frozen. The life I had spent years building collapsed in an instant. The man I had devoted myself to, the father of our son, had wounded me in the most devastating way. I had given him everything, my trust, my loyalty, and years of my life that I could never reclaim. He, on the other hand, didn't even bother to defend himself. As I crumpled a photo of us in happier times, I caught his expression. One I could never forget. It wasn't remorse or regret, but instead a look of exhaustion and annoyance, as though my pain was merely an inconvenience. It pierced me like a blade, sharp and unrelenting. The house, once filled with joy and comfort, became hollow and unrecognizable. The walls, the furniture, even the family photos felt foreign. It was as though not only his belongings, but his presence had been stripped from the home. He left without hesitation, abandoning me to confront my anguish alone. Day and night, the pain remained, unyielding. My arm ached constantly, a cramp born from stress that pushed my nerves to their limit. The thought of him being with her made my body tense, my vision blur. I tried calming myself with hot tea and deep breathing, but nothing worked. The only solace I found was in my son, Mike. At 18, Mike looked older than his years. His broad shoulders and serious expression reflected the burdens he carried, giving him the air of someone far beyond his age. He spoke of his father with disdain, his voice laced with a contempt that offered no forgiveness. "I never want to see him again," he declared firmly. A real man wouldn't do that. When he looked at me, his eyes glistened with tears as he took in the changes the ordeal had etched into my face, the silver strands in my hair, the deepened lines of worry. Clenching his fists, he said, "You're strong, Mom. I'm proud of you. But you have to let me help." Every evening, Mike came home earlier than usual. I knew it wasn't by choice, but because my condition scared him. He took over little routines my husband had once done, helping with dinner, setting the table, but Mike did it with love, not obligation. He made me herbal tea before bed and gently covered me with a blanket if I fell asleep on the couch. Sometimes, I'd wake in the stillness of the night, only to find him sitting in the living room, his gaze fixed on me. His face, far too serious for someone his age, bore the weight of too many worries. One particularly difficult evening, I broke. Sitting at the kitchen table, tears streamed down my face, falling into my unfinished cup of coffee. Mike walked in and placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Mom, I'm here. You're not alone," he said softly. I looked up at him, my little boy who once feared the dark but now stood before me as a man. My voice shook as I said, "You don't have to sacrifice yourself for me, Mike. You have your own life. Don't stop because of me." But he didn't move away. Instead, he sat beside me, his expression unwavering. "Mom, I'm staying. You're my family. If I leave now, who will hold your hand?" The tears came harder, and he wrapped his arms around me. For the first time in ages, I allowed myself to be vulnerable. Mike's strength was far greater than I could have ever imagined. He wouldn't let me retreat into despair. He encouraged me to go to the gym with him to distract myself, and he insisted I join an art class despite my resistance. "You need something just for you, Mom. You still have so much to give even if you can't see it," he said. Slowly, I began to smile more, even laugh. The dark circles under my eyes faded, and I stopped resenting the gray in my hair, learning to see it as a mark of wisdom. We cooked dinners together, took walks in the park, and one day, he surprised me with a trip to a small village I had always dreamed of visiting. "You were right," he said, gazing out the window of a quaint little house. "Life really can start over, even when it feels like everything is lost." As I hugged him, I realized his words were true. The pain of betrayal had become a scar, a reminder of what I had endured but had not let break me. Mike had become more than a son. He was my anchor, my confidant, and the person who reminded me of my own strength. Later that evening, as I cleared the dinner table, my hands trembled despite my efforts to appear steady. My life had been a constant effort to hold myself together, but it felt as though control was slipping away. The air around us was thick with tension, like a storm on the brink of breaking. I focused on the small tasks, plates, cups, utensils, trying to steady my thoughts. Mike sat silently, his gaze fixed on the table, though I could sense his thoughts mirrored mine. Over the past weeks, he had become more than just my son. He was my lifeline, the light that cut through the darkness. But the events of the previous night had unsettled me, as I remembered his words. "You deserve to be happy." My heartbeat quickened. His sincerity, the tenderness in his voice as he placed an arm around me, had stirred something deeper than maternal gratitude. I despised myself for feeling such weakness. After finishing the dishes, I heard his quiet footsteps approaching. Before he spoke, I already sensed his presence. "Mom," he said softly, his tone uncertain, "why have you been avoiding me?" I wanted to tell him everything was fine, that I was just tired, but the words caught in my throat. The moment his gaze met mine, I felt exposed, as though he could see right through me. "I don't know how to explain," I whispered, avoiding eye contact. There's just too much to deal with." His hand rested lightly on my shoulder, its warmth calming. "You don't have to handle this alone, Mom. I'm here, and I always will be." That evening, when I returned home from the store, I was met with an unexpected sight. On the doorstep was a bouquet of wildflowers, their delicate petals still adorned with dewdrops as if freshly picked. Turning, I saw Mike standing a short distance away, smiling softly. "They're for you," he said simply. "You haven't smiled in so long. I thought you needed this." Taking the flowers into my hands, I felt a pang in my chest, not from sadness, but from a deeper emotion. The bouquet symbolized his care, his wish to ease my burdens. "Thank you, Mike," I murmured, pressing the flowers to my chest. "They're beautiful." Satisfied with my reaction, he nodded and headed to the kitchen to make tea. I lingered by the window, clutching the bouquet, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to cry, not out of pain, but out of gratitude. Every day, Mike found new ways to show his support. He took a part-time job and brought home thoughtful gestures, small gifts like a chocolate bar or a handwritten note filled with kind words. But what touched me most were his actions, ensuring I ate, urging me to rest, and reminding me that life continued. One evening, as he returned home, I noticed the exhaustion etched into his face. Dropping his bag on the floor, he walked over and hugged me tightly. The embrace was so sudden, so genuine, that I froze in surprise. "You're pushing yourself too hard for me," I said, trying to pull away, but his grip didn't loosen. "Mom, you deserve to live," he said, cutting me off. "And I'm happy. Isn't that what matters?" His voice carried a conviction that left me speechless. The sincerity in his eyes made me feel both shielded and terrified. As time went on, I began to confront emotions I couldn't admit, feelings too complicated to untangle. Every gesture, every smile, every act of care made it harder to maintain the boundaries I knew I had to keep. One evening, sitting at the table, I made a decision. "Mike," I started, struggling to keep my tone steady, "you've done so much for me, but I need you to think about your own life, your dreams, your future." He frowned slightly. "Don't you understand, Mom? You are my life. Everything I do is for us." His words struck me deeply, leaving me unable to respond. The tension between us, the kind I had been too afraid to acknowledge, grew heavier. Later, alone in my room, I wrestled with my emotions. I knew it was wrong, yet every moment with him made it harder to push the thoughts aside. I needed to find a way to manage this, for his sake and for mine. The next day, I decided to distract myself. We went for a walk in the park, reminiscing about the past and how much things had changed. At some point, I noticed he was holding my hand, just as he had when he was a child. But this time, the gesture carried a strength and protectiveness that stirred something deep within me. That evening, I gripped the edge of the table as if it could anchor me. Mike stood close, his presence overwhelming. His gaze pierced through me, reaching the places I wanted to keep hidden, even from him, especially from him. "Mom, why do you keep everything bottled up?" His voice was soft, but the pain in it was undeniable. I pressed my lips together, unable to respond right away. "I can see how hard this is for you. Let me help." "You've already done too much," I whispered, lowering my head. "You deserve your own life, your joys, your dreams. And My voice broke, unable to finish the thought. "And I'm just a broken mess pulling you down." He stepped closer, and a shiver ran through me. Taking my hands gently, he held them in his own, squeezing as if to share his strength. "Don't you dare think that about yourself. You're my family, I raised my head to argue, but his eyes held me captive. In them, I saw something I couldn't define. It wasn't just the love of a son for his mother. It was deeper, more complex. My heart raced as the silence stretched between us. "Mike," I finally whispered, trying to sound firm, though my voice trembled. "You're incredible, and I'm so proud of you. But there are boundaries, things that can't— that—" Before I could finish, he released my hands and stepped back, though his gaze never wavered. I could see the conflict in his expression, pain, frustration, but most of all, longing. "What if those boundaries are what's keeping us from being happy?" he murmured, his voice barely audible but resolute. His words stole my breath. I took a step back, then another, until my back hit the wall. "This isn't right, Mike," I said, my voice shaky as I hugged myself. "You're my son. You don't understand what this looks like." "I do understand, Mom," he replied, his voice sharp yet trembling with emotion. "I understand more than you think. I see how much you're hurting, how you cry at night and try to look strong for me, but it's not fair. You shouldn't have to go through this alone." I turned away, tears burning my eyes. I had always prided myself on my strength, holding it together for Mike's sake, but his words tore through my defenses. That night, I lay in bed, staring into the darkness, his voice echoing in my mind. I replayed the moment in the kitchen again and again. Why was I so afraid? Why did his presence stir such conflicting emotions? I pressed my face into the pillow, trying to stifle a sob. Then the door to my room creaked open softly, and Mike appeared in the doorway. "I didn't mean to frighten you, Mom," he murmured softly, standing in the dim light. "But I can't just stand by and watch you struggle." I shut my eyes, but I could hear his footsteps drawing nearer. He settled on the edge of the bed, not touching me, yet his presence was so tangible it felt as if he were right beside me. "I'm scared, Mike," I finally confessed. "Scared of what I feel, scared I'll hurt you, scared I'll destroy everything between us." He didn't respond immediately, and the silence that filled the room carried more weight than any words could. Slowly, I opened my eyes to look at him. His face was so close I could see every mark, every line etched by exhaustion. "You could never hurt me, Mom," he said softly, his voice steady. The next morning, I pretended as though nothing had happened. I boiled water for tea and prepared breakfast, but the tension between us lingered, unspoken but undeniable. Mike tried to behave as if everything was normal too, but his eyes betrayed him. We sat across from each other at the table, fumbling for safe topics like strangers avoiding a delicate subject. "Don't be late for work today," I said with a forced smile. "You're so responsible. I'm proud of you." "And you?" he asked suddenly, cutting through my pretense. "When are you going to start being proud of yourself?" His words caught me off guard, hitting a nerve. I glanced at him, my throat tightening, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. The question haunted me throughout the day. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps I needed to let myself believe that happiness was possible. But each time the thought crossed my mind, something deep within resisted. Later that night, I sat on the porch, letting the crisp night air soothe my restless thoughts. The stars above offered a quiet, indifferent comfort. Mike soon joined me, his footsteps soft on the wooden planks. "You always told me that honesty can overcome anything," he began, easing into the seat beside me. "Sometimes," I replied, my gaze fixed on the sky. "Honesty feels more terrifying than lies." He reached for my hand, and though I hesitated, I didn't pull away. His grip was warm, steady, grounding. "I just want you to know," he said firmly, "that no matter how scared or uncertain you feel, I'll always be here for you." There was a quiet strength in his voice that made me turn to look at him. He was my son, but in that moment, he felt like more. My anchor, my hope. For the first time in a long while, I believed I could face the journey ahead, even if I had to take the steps on my own.